The story begins in the humid summer of 1842, when whispers traveled across the sprawling fields of the Georgia plantation owned by Jonathan Wainwright, a man both feared and envied by the people of his town. He was known for his wealth, his control, over hundreds of acres of land, and his rigid sense of authority. But behind the grandeur of his estate and the polished surface of Southern gentility, there brewed something far more scandalous and dangerous. His wife Eleanor Wainwright, a woman of rare composure and intelligence, had long sensed a change in her husband's behavior. He became distant, dismissive, and prone to sudden bursts of anger that seemed to rise from guilt rather than frustration. She felt an unease that could not be explained by words, and one late evening after the moon had risen high over the magnolia trees, she decided to follow her instincts and uncover the truth. The great house stood silent as she stepped through the corridors, her bare feet pressing against the wooden floors, every creak echoing like thunder in the stillness. She moved toward the west wing, where Jonathan had claimed he would be working on ledgers. Yet the light under the door was soft, not from the lamp of study, but the flickering glow of a fire. She opened the door without sound, and what she saw froze her heart there. Her husband lay not alone, but surrounded by 3 of the young male slaves from the field, their bodies tangled in the intimacy of forbidden pleasure. Her breath caught in her throat. The sight burned itself into her mind like an image carved by fire. She did not scream. She did not collapse. Instead, she turned and walked away, her silence heavier than any cry could have been the next morning. The plantation awoke to chaos. Eleanor's calm voice summoned the household staff, and within hours word spread across the property that all were to gather in the courtyard. She sent riders to town, demanding the presence of the mayor, the sheriff, and every notable family. She declared that her husband's sin would not remain hidden, that justice would be seen by every eye that dared to judge her. When the townsfolk arrived, drawn by curiosity and fear, they found a scene unlike any they had witnessed. Jonathan was bound to the old whipping post in the center of the square, the same post where he himself had punished countless slaves over the years. Now it was he who stood stripped of dignity, trembling not from cold, but from shame. Eleanor stood before him in a pale gown, her expression unreadable, her voice calm as she spoke of betrayal, hypocrisy, and the desecration of moral order. She spoke not only as a wife wronged, but as a woman who had lived too long under the shadow of her husband's tyranny. Every word she uttered struck like a lash upon his pride. She told the crowd of his secret indulgence, the scandal of his actions, and how those he had once treated as property had shared his bed in the most intimate of acts. The townspeople gasped. In horror, some turned away. Others watched with cruel fascination. Jonathan tried to speak, but Eleanor raised her hand and silence fell. She ordered that the same punishment he had given his disobedient slaves be delivered to him in front of all. His peers, his pleas were ignored. The whip cracked, and with each strike his authority crumbled piece by piece, until he was no longer the feared master, but a man reduced to the same suffering he had inflicted upon others. Eleanor stood unmoving. As the lashes drew blood, her face expressionless, yet her eyes gleamed with something between vengeance and sorrow. For deep inside her, she felt the collapse of not just a marriage, but a world built on lies. When the punishment ended, she turned to the crowd and told them that this day would be remembered not for the humiliation of her husband, but as the revelation of truth, that behind every mask of respectability lay rot and deceit. She walked away, leaving Jonathan broken and silent. The crowd dispersed, murmuring the story that would ripple through generations. The plantation never recovered from that day, and Eleanor left soon after, taking nothing but her name. The tale of the night she discovered her husband's betrayal and the public reckoning that followed became legend, whispered across taverns and church pews as both warning and spectacle. It marked the end of one man's dominion and the rise of a woman's wrath, wrapped in quiet fire and unbroken will. After the public humiliation that Eleanor Wainwright orchestrated, the air around the Georgia plantation grew heavy with tension and disbelief. The people who had gathered that day could not erase the image of their once respected master bound and broken before the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire through the town, painting Jonathan Wainwright as both sinner and fool, while Eleanor became an object of awe and fear. Her calm composure during the punishment left many unsettled, for they saw in her eyes not mere anger but something colder and more deliberate. The very next morning she rose before dawn and walked through the estate as if surveying the ruins of an empire. Every room carried the weight of betrayal. Every piece of furniture, every curtain seemed to breathe with the ghosts of deceit. The slaves watched her cautiously, unsure of whether to fear her or revere her. For though she had avenged herself upon her husband, they knew that power still flowed through her veins like quiet fire. She went to her husband's study, the place where his lies had begun, and found him seated there, wrapped in bandages. His pride shattered his gaze, distant and hollow. He did not look up when she entered. She told him that she would not. Divorce him for such matters were unthinkable in their time. But she would take from him everything that gave him strength, his authority, his control, his respect. She declared that from that day forward, she would run the plantation, and he would live as a shadow within it, no longer a master but a ghost haunting the land he once ruled. Jonathan tried to object, but his voice trembled. The humiliation had crushed him. She turned and left him there like an afterthought, and so began a strange, new order on the Wainwright estate under Eleanor's command. The plantation changed. She dismissed the overseers who had served her husband and replaced them with people who had once been silenced. She allowed the workers small freedoms unheard of before: the right to keep part of their harvest, the right to rest without fear of punishment, and though her motives were not born entirely of compassion, her rule became one of discipline rather than cruelty. The town, however, was divided. Some saw her as a woman of righteousness, one who had exposed hypocrisy and reclaimed her dignity. Others whispered that she was possessed by vengeance and had violated the sanctity of marriage by making her husband's shame a public spectacle. The church condemned her. The wealthy families avoided her, yet none dared challenge her openly, for she held their secrets too. And in a place where sin wore the mask of virtue, Eleanor had become the one who tore away the masks. Jonathan, meanwhile, withered, within the house, his days consumed by silence, his nights haunted by memories of the lash in the eyes that had watched his undoing. He tried to regain his standing, but every time he stepped outside, whispers followed him. He could not meet the gaze of his peers, nor the quiet pity of those he once ruled. His former slaves now looked upon him without fear, and that cut deeper than any whip. One evening, months after his punishment, he vanished from the estate, leaving behind only a letter addressed to Eleanor. In it, he begged forgiveness not for what he had done, but for what she had made of him. He wrote that she had stripped him of everything, even the ability to despise her. She read the letter once, then burned it in the fire, the ashes curling, like tiny ghosts of his words as they rose and disappeared into the air. From that moment, Eleanor became a solitary figure haunting her own home. She attended no gatherings, spoke little, and spent her nights walking through the gardens that her husband had once boasted of. The town spoke of her as a woman cursed by her own revenge. Yet those who saw her in passing said her face carried not sorrow, but a strange calm, as though she had made peace with the ruin she had wrought years later. The plantation fell into decline. The land sold in fragments, the great house left to decay, but the legend of that day remained alive. The tale of how a wife had turned the symbol of power into a spectacle of shame, how she had forced the entire town to bear witness to the truth they all ignored. Jonathan's name became a cautionary whisper among men who ruled their homes with arrogance, while Eleanor's name lingered as both warning and inspiration. She had shown that beneath the gentility of the South, there existed a storm that no man could contain, and that a woman scorned when armed with intelligence and cold resolve could dismantle an empire not through force, but through the weight of her will. The fields grew quiet over time, the house empty, the story fading into folklore, yet somewhere in the collective memory of that town the echo of that public reckoning endured, reminding all who remembered that beneath pride and possession lies the fragility of power, and that once broken it can never be restored. The aftermath of the Wainwright scandal left scars not only on the land but on the very soul of the town that had witnessed it. The people went on with their daily routines, but a silent unease lingered over every conversation, every gathering, every sermon from the pulpit, for they had seen what no community of their time had ever imagined possible. A powerful plantation owner stripped of his authority and punished by his own wife before the eyes of his peers. The memory refused to fade in. The months that followed the tale spread beyond Georgia. carried by travelers, merchants, and gossiping preachers, until it became less a story and more a parable of power, pride, and downfall. Eleanor Wainwright lived in seclusion within the crumbling mansion, her presence a ghostly reminder of what had transpired. She no longer attended church, and the women who once gossiped about her with envy now whispered her name with both admiration and fear. Some claimed she had gone mad, walking the corridors, at night speaking to the spirits of those who had suffered under her husband's rule. Others said she had found peace in solitude, and that her silence was not madness, but strength. Jonathan Wainwright's disappearance remained a mystery. Some believed he had taken his own life, unable to live with his disgrace. Others said he fled west under a false name seeking redemption, or perhaps simply escape. But no one ever saw him again, and his absence became part of the myth like a shadow stretching. Beyond the grave, Eleanor assumed control of what remained of the plantation, though her leadership grew more symbolic than practical. She refused to remarry, rejecting the advances of men who thought they could tame or save her. She told one suitor that she had no desire for salvation, for she had already walked through hell and found her truth in its ashes under her quiet governance. The enslaved men and women on her land experienced changes they could hardly comprehend. She allowed them to live as families without interference, permitted small gardens of their own, and forbade the use of the whip. Her orders were strict but fair, and though freedom was still far from reach, her actions planted seeds of dignity in soil that had long been barren. The neighboring landowners saw these decisions as weakness. Some mocked her, others feared her, believing that she sought to undo the Southern order with her strange mercy. But Eleanor cared little for their opinions. She had seen the cruelty of men disguised as civility, and had chosen a different path even if it left her alone. Her actions began to attract attention from abolitionist circles. Though she never claimed allegiance to their cause, she received letters from Northern women who praised her defiance, calling her the lady who made justice visible, but Eleanor never replied to them. She understood that her actions were not born from a grand moral cause, but from a deeply personal wound. Her rebellion was not political, it was human. The product of love betrayed and power corrupted. As years passed, the estate decayed, the great oaks that lined the path grew wild. The once manicured gardens turned into untamed forests, and the grand house began to rot from within. Yet Eleanor remained there, growing older but never weaker. Her servant said she often sat on the veranda at dusk, watching the horizon where the fields met the sky, her gaze distant, as though she could still see the moment when the crowd had gathered, the moment when her world had shattered and remade itself in fire and humiliation. The town moved on, but the legend of that day never died. New generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, each version more distorted than the last. Some said Eleanor was a witch who cursed her husband. Others said she was a saint who punished sin itself. Yet all agreed on one thing: she had changed the way people looked at power and shame in the years before the war, when the South began to tremble under the weight of its own sins. The story of Eleanor Wainwright resurfaced in Northern papers as a symbol of rebellion. Though distorted beyond truth, it served as a prophecy of the crumbling order that was to come. When Eleanor finally died at the age of 70, the town gathered once more at the gates of the decaying plantation. No family claimed her. No preacher spoke over her grave. Yet hundreds came out of curiosity or respect. Her body was buried under the same magnolia tree where she had once confronted her husband, her tombstone bearing no inscription, but her initials and the date of her death after her burial. The mansion was left to ruin, the windows shattered, the roof caved in, and the vines swallowed its walls until only whispers and ghosts remained. Travelers who passed by the property said that on quiet nights they could hear the faint echo of a woman's voice carried by the wind. Some claimed it was Eleanor still speaking to the past. Others said it was simply the sound of history refusing to die. The Wainwright name vanished from record books, the estate divided and sold piece by piece. Yet her story endured, carried by word of mouth as a legend of justice, born from betrayal. For in a time when women were silent, she had spoken. When men ruled through cruelty, she had defied, and when shame was meant to destroy her, she turned it into a weapon. The punishment that day had not only broken a man, it had shattered the illusion of untouchable power, and in doing so had forced a town to confront its own hypocrisy. The echoes of that reckoning would ripple through generations, reminding all who remembered that truth cannot be buried, and that the strength of one wounded soul can outlast the empires built on deceit.